We have Carrie Staton, who's director of the West Virginia University Technical Assistance to Brownfield Communities, or TAB for short, and Patrick Kirby, who's the chief operating officer of Raze International Inc., and they'll be presenting our session 3, Partnerships for Land Transfers. Thank you, Carrie and Patrick.
Hi. Maybe we can't do our fun. Hello. We're going to go out with a bang. We're excited to talk to you today about property transfers. I'm Carrie Staton. As Sylvia said, I'm the director of West Virginia University Technical Assistance to Brownfields, or TAB. We are funded by EPA Region 3 to provide technical assistance to communities, to nonprofit organizations, to anybody who's working on brownfield redevelopment in Region 3 in the Mid-Atlantic. We're complicating everything because that's what we do. We were going to try to walk around, but that's okay. So we provide technical assistance to communities across the region. All of our services are funded by EPA and are completely free to you, and we can answer your questions, help you apply for EPA grants, any number of things, anything brownfield related. We're your folks, and we've got some information on the table back there with EPA if you want to find us. And my co-presenter today is Patrick Kirby. I'll let him introduce himself.
Good afternoon. My name is Patrick Kirby. I'm with Raze International. We are a demolition abatement remediation firm. I've been working in brownfields for over 20 years. I was working at the Brownfields Assistance Center for a while, but I'm an Eastern Shore boy by heart, and that's where I grew up. So I was happy to come back to Maryland. Raze works in the Maryland, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Ohio. And we were both involved in a number of projects that we're willing to tell you guys about today.
So I had planned to see who was in the room, but Adam Ortiz kind of stole my thunder. He didn't ask me first if he could do that. But I have some additional questions that he didn't ask. So we already talked about the kind of organizations that you work at, but we also wanted to get an idea if there's anybody here who owns a property, a brownfield property, or possible brownfield property. Yes? Anybody else? Anyone who's applied for an EPA grant ever before? Yes? Yes? Any current grantees? Just Sylvia here today? Awesome. How many folks are here on your own to this conference? Colleen? Came with a friend? Made some new friends today? Everybody, I hope? Yeah, awesome. All right, so we're going to talk today about land transfers. There's a lot of contexts in which you might talk about a land or property transfer, but today we're focused on transfers of property in the context of seeking an EPA cleanup grant. And we've both worked on projects mostly in West Virginia, that's what we're going to talk to you about today, but all over where we've helped communities find a new property owner to be able to apply for an EPA cleanup grant. We'll talk a little bit about when that's important, why, what to look for, and how to find your perfect match in brownfield. So as a quick refresher, to apply for an EPA cleanup grant, an applicant must be one of these eligible entities, so a state, local, or tribal government, or a general purpose unit of local government, a regional council or redevelopment agency, sometimes these are called local development districts, a nonprofit organization, a quasi-governmental agency, so sometimes economic development authorities are these sort of kind of government, kind of not, it depends on your jurisdiction, and you must own the property when you apply. These are sort of the basic threshold criteria. And so if you own the property and you meet some of those and you're wondering, okay, well, can I just apply for the grant? There may be an issue. And Patrick's going to talk to you about that. Right? Yeah. Do you want that?
So you want money. I mean, really, at the end of the day, right? I mean, so I didn't see a lot of hands go up as it relates to the grants, and you guys have gotten grants. But the grants went from $200,000 for cleanup to $500 to $2 million this year. Holy cow! Why didn't? $500. And you guys, who applied for this year? There's so much money out there to clean those sites up, and they get more expensive. I mean, that's wild. So the whole key is, how do you become eligible? Well, you might be the potentially responsible party. That is definitely, you're the problem. But what we're going to talk about today is how lots of times local governments or quasi-governmental agencies acquired property and could be considered the potentially responsible party, but they really aren't. I mean, you could find another partner because you didn't really know what you were doing. You might have just taken it on because somebody thought it was a good idea. Of course, no one had ever done anything with that property, and they offered it to you, so you took it. Why would you do a phase one? And then you didn't have your due diligence, or you knew you had to do your due diligence, but you took the property first because whoever was transferring it to you had to transfer it to you at that time. And so you said, oh, we'll go ahead and take it and we'll do it later because you did not understand the eligibility requirements. This way. So now what do you do? So how do we handle this? So you got to find somebody to solve your problem. You're a potentially responsible party, or you didn't do your due diligence, and you've called the Assistance Center, or you've called EPA. They know that your reuse is awesome. It's a great new project. You want to do something with the property, but you need money to clean it up. So there are different ways to handle it. We've done, and this is all stuff that's been done. EPA is aware that it's happening. The people involved in these transactions are involved with, or know what's happening. There's private owners that may transfer to a public entity for the purpose of cleaning it up for later redevelopment. There's one public entity, say a county commission, that may need to transfer it to another entity, even in some examples we'll give you later, a school board, or a private owner to a nonprofit. So maybe the person that owns it doesn't really know how to get rid of it. Nobody will take it, so you transfer it to economic development agency, which tends to be nonprofits. You also may have a public entity like a county commission transfer it to a development agency. You can do that. Or you have a nonprofit that owned it. They were great. Habitat for Humanity is an example, and they somehow acquired property that they are considered the potentially responsible party for, or they didn't do their due diligence on, and it needs to be transferred to a city or somebody else that could actually apply for the grant. So what are you looking for? You're looking for somebody you know, typically. You want to start local. The reason that's important is because it's really about the relationship building. And you want someone, so when we talk about cities, like a nonprofit transferring it to a city, the city's probably managed federal grants before. That's a plus, because part of the application, not eligibility, but grading is what's your experience with managing grants. The other piece is it really the right fit? So what's the end use? Could you find somebody that actually needs the property for their end use? So there's a county commission that's transferring it to another entity that's going to use it for recreational purposes, and maybe it's a nonprofit that specializes in recreational things. But you also need them to take the risk. It's not like we were never told no, but we're going to go through some examples here in a few minutes, but I mean, we've done this at least a dozen times. And they have to understand it too. They have to understand that the due diligence is part of it. So it's not just, okay, we'll take on the property and we're going to make a bunch of money, or the private owners have to have agreements in place for what's going to happen at the end of the day. So we've had properties that have transferred from private to public, cleaned it up, back to private. And what's interesting about that is there'll be the question, well, wait a minute, they're using public money and then the private entity is going to maybe get it back, or some other version of that private entity gets it back. But the whole goal is, if it's redevelopment, is we spend so much time looking for that redeveloper, and sometimes you have them and they just got the property in some weird way, or way that made them potentially responsible party, and now at the end of the day, instead of looking for a brand new redeveloper, you've reduced their cost because it's not economical for 2 acres to be a $500,000 cleanup job. Like, it's just, the math isn't going to work. So you come in the middle with that public assistance. But they have to understand the value of phase ones and phase twos, and they have to be willing to do it. And oftentimes, you have to do it quick. Although, since the grants were just due, and you guys didn't apply for them yesterday or Monday, you have now another 9 months or a year, but you can set up and tee them off for next year and be ready, because these land transactions tend not to be quick. So when we were talking about this presentation, it's really, what are you trying to do, and how you make these decisions? Who do you ask? So who could actually, when you go to someone and say, hey, will you take on this property? We have this great project, but I was told that we could get money to clean it up, but we're not eligible. Will you take on the property? And it could be contaminated, maybe perceived to be contaminated, but it may really be contaminated. What is your goal? And the goal of the end use, and what are you prepping for, actually changes who you might approach. So what is your existing relationship with your potential partner? You want it to be a good relationship. You want it to be somebody you may have already done a deal with before on something, that you trust them, that you know they're going to do the paperwork, and that they're stable. There are oftentimes we run into this issue of what's the transition plan as things happen and things in organizations change. So make sure you have a good existing relationship with them. So now, Carrie's going to talk to you about building strong relationships, right? Because now that, well, so everybody has different risk tolerance. Carrie and I have known each other for 12 years. I was going to say longer because it feels like longer. And the key is, if she had property that was contaminated and she was going to apply for a grant and we were redeveloping a brownfield, and she came to me and said, Patrick, your new organization or some nonprofit I'm running, would you take that property? I would say yes. I would probably say yes before I got all the details, because this is what I do and what I'm used to. And I'm sure, Carrie, if I did the same thing to you,
I would have a lot of questions.
Right. So you see, I mean, so even then, people just act differently. So even if we work well together, that doesn't mean that they're just going to take it blindly. So having all the information up front is important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the point about that is that when you're talking to somebody, you're not necessarily in this situation looking for a transactional relationship. You're building a longer relationship. So either you already have that relationship, or you're starting a new relationship, but it's more than just, here's $500,000, here's a property, thank you, next, right? You're looking for, and in all the examples that we're going to tell you about, that's what it was, right? And so it's usually a property that, I think earlier somebody was talking about difficult markets, right? If the market was going to get it redeveloped, if it was worth the money that it takes to redevelop it, somebody would just come in and buy it, and it would be a traditional transaction. But that's not what a lot of these brownfield properties look like, and that's why the investment from programs like the EPA Brownfield program are important to get them ready to make those numbers work, so that it can get redeveloped either into green space or to a new economic opportunity for that community. And so because you're talking about a serious relationship, you want to make sure that everybody's on the same page from the beginning, your property prenup, right? So you want to make sure that it's all up front, everybody's on the same page about who's paying for what, who's paying for the due diligence, the environmental site assessments, who's paying for the holding costs. Is the property being purchased by the new owner, or is it a straight donation? What are the roles? What is everybody's roles? What am I responsible for? What is the previous owner responsible for? Who's going to manage the grant? Who's going to manage the environmental process? What happens next? And what happens after cleanup? What happens if the cleanup's more expensive than the grant you get? What happens if you don't get a grant, right? All of these things that you want to have on the table from the beginning, and conversations you want to have from the get-go, and that's why that relationship piece is important, because you don't want to make assumptions and then get down the line and have a misunderstanding. All right, so we have 3 project goals, successful case studies, to tell you about different versions. Patrick talked a little bit about the different kinds of property transactions, different entities that may exchange property, and so we have 3 different versions of that, and I'm going to let you start off with the library.
So is anybody here from the library? Okay. Does anybody have a library that's an end use, like that needs a new library in their community? They're raising money for it, maybe growing one. Okay, because I've seen it more popular in different communities now, honestly. Like we went through cafes, we went through breweries, we're in rec centers, and now I'm seeing libraries being used as you need a public end use for a lot of the projects, and that's a good anchor site. So what happened was, in this particular case, you had a city that owned property in the county. Okay, so it's just an island out there, city property. You have a library that's well-loved, right in a very small downtown in Shepherdstown, West Virginia, right across the border there near Boonesboro, Maryland. And you have librarians saying, hey, we need more space because they had 18,000 people at the time. Jefferson County keeps growing, and they're supposed to serve 18,000 of the total part of the county, and they had 2,000 square feet. That doesn't quite hit the formula for how many square feet per capita they're supposed to have. So they needed a new library. So we had to find someone, because the city they were the potentially responsible party because they had used this as a landfill between 1955 and 1961, and so they're out. The county wasn't necessarily interested because of county-city politics, and so we talked to the Economic Development Authority and made a pitch as to why having a library in general, like in the 21st century, was a good investment. And so we ended up having to do the land transaction a few days before the grants were due, but we luckily had been working with DEP, who had previous environmental data on the landfill that we were able to use. We were able to use other environmental assessment grants, EPA grants that the state had already to look at this site. And the reason everybody was interested in this site was not because they wanted to clean up a landfill. Nobody wants to do that. I mean, unless you're in the landfill department here, I'm sorry. Because it's important, but everybody loves funding a new library. So we had this spitfire of a librarian who was worked on this project this was in 2009 that we started, 2010. It started with a $5,000 private foundation grant, and the local community raised $3 million to build a new library over the course of 10 years. And the county was generous enough to give $100,000 to that. It was great. You couldn't always rely on the public piece. But the EDA also went through multiple phases themselves. So it wasn't just the EDA director we wanted on board. It's the whole board of the EDA that you're educating. And so they accepted it. They did the cleanup grant. They knew from the get-go that they were going to manage the cleanup grant. And they were used to managing federal money and other things. So when we fit totally, at the end of the day, it actually just opened up last year in the summer. It was hot. July of last year, opened its doors. But it was a key piece of it. Actually, we got funding for stormwater tied into EPA with another development that was going in that needed a stormwater basin. So it was a number of entities that the EDA was key to working with too, because it was economic development for the area. It wasn't just for building a library. And so they had to be, but toward the end, it's taken a long time for them to raise this money, and the EDA was still holding the property. And if you guys been anywhere, there are other people on the board of the EDA that may question, well, why don't we just use this property? Because now we own it. But that's why the upfront agreements were in place. We probably had 5 different resolutions from the library board wasn't the same. It didn't stay the same over that whole period. There'd be new people coming on board saying, do we still want to pursue this project even after the site's cleaned up? We had to educate folks and from the library too, that are going to have it at the end of the day, on land use covenants, on different things they were going to have to do to continue to update it. So I never would have thought that the library would have been the way to go, but it really just started with a call as a request to the Assistance Center they wanted to write a federal grant, an earmark grant, way back, and said, can you do something? And the library had worked with an architecture firm to do a green library design, way back. So they had that Like, you have the reuse plan, that's key to it. And then you have the community partners, and it's really hard to say no to all the folks that are working from a library. So finding the repurpose and finding who the advocates are is key. And then make sure you're talking to your Economic Development Authority, I think. Does anybody have any questions in terms of the transactional piece of that? That was back, EPA was aware when we handled it from a cleanup standpoint, and they knew what was happening at the end of the day. They knew where the city was, they knew the library was receiving funding from the city, so that's why they couldn't be an eligible entity.
Patrick, and Carrie, did the EDA have any fears about taking on liability either for reporting to the state about contamination or for then needing to clean up any of the contamination? Were they worried about liability for either of those things?
They were. We luckily had that's where those assessments up front come in, is it really wasn't that bad. I know it's easy to say. And the big hiccup, I think, was at the end of the day, we actually had the monitoring wells removed by DEP that they had on site, which made them feel better because they hadn't hit anything too significant. Right, it was basically because it was a landfill, it wasn't a lot of, there weren't heavy metals.
Washing machines here,
But because it was a landfill.
It wasn't like asbestos landfill.
But what it turned out was one of the land use restrictions was there was a particular contaminant that I'm not going to remember that there's a limit on because they had not tested for it at the time when the monitoring well was in. And so it was easier to say you couldn't use the groundwater, which is pretty typical, without doing additional sampling. But yeah. Everybody always has concerns about the liability, and I guess showing that it was more paper liability than real liability that it was going to be, and that's where the voluntary cleanup program in the state came in, that the whole site went through the voluntary cleanup program.
And I guess related to liability, if there was, I guess one of the things that when you have a third party like this taking on a property, they're going to be concerned about being mandated to clean up a certain amount of a site or report. And how are you able to, assuage those fears of having to, they're trying to take on a site like this. How do you assuage those fears that they're not going to be saddled with some expensive cleanup responsibility?
Well, when you start with the facts and the details and you say, so this site has never been a value, other than, the monitoring wells that were there from DEP. The DEP was not, West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection was not actively searching to hit the city with fines. It just happened to be this was city property that was available, and the mayor at the time said this would be a good location for a new library if it had to go in. And then there was significant community involvement before we ever found an end user. So we did a lot of public meetings on the design of because what I didn't want to do is get down the path, get the EDA to accept it, and then someone say the library doesn't want to move out of town. Does that, it's on the edge of town, and that's a longer story, but it was still within walking distance to a number of different stakeholders, and so getting all those stakeholders involved, then they could also support the EDA's decision at the time, and involving the agency from the beginning, DEP from the beginning, in those meetings, both with talking with the town of Shepherdstown as well as the EDA.
And the kind of the prenuptial agreement you talked about, is there like a formal name for that sort of thing? Does it always take a form of like a MO? What does it look like? What is an instrument called? MOU,
Memorandum of Understanding.
Okay.
Now I would say that you could even go as far as to do some sort of operating agreement of the property, because there are different pieces to that, but most of the communities we worked with don't have like that significant other level of capacity. So we were working with 2 law firms pro bono at the time, one for the library and one for the EDA. Well, the EDA had a paid one, but the libraries was pro bono, navigating the language back and forth.
Thank you.
Final ownership.
Now, and the final ownership was not going to be the EDA. It was going to be transferred back to the library, which was a new thing. But that was in the agreement. And that was important over time because of the changes at all the organizations. So Alex Rickley Memorial Soccer Complex in Berkeley Springs, West Virginia, also in the Eastern Panhandle, very close to Maryland. Got a call about this from a county commissioner. They had accepted property of this site, the county commission had. It was a former furniture finishing place, maybe wrecking yard at some point, lots of things that you wouldn't be like, hey, you know what we should do next week? We should turn it into a soccer field for our kids. So when they did, and they got it because it was open land and flat, and being from the Eastern Shore, I'm used to flat land, but in the mountains, we don't have a lot of it. And I will tell you that they went ahead and started to use it, and then they'd get parent complaints of some wires, maybe some broken glass, other things that they didn't really want as part of the soccer field. It just added to the challenges of the game. So since the county had accepted it without due diligence, they weren't eligible for anything. And so they were calling me with a problem because they were worried about specifically being a liable party for any number of things. So I was I don't know, confident, maybe too arrogant, and I said, well, we just did this. Let's go to the EDA. The Economic Development Authority in this county will take it on. Why? Because we just did this in Shepherdstown. And they didn't. They told me no, and they said they were too afraid to take it on. So I said, okay, but somebody can take it on. So we went to the Board of Education and said, hey, you guys have a facility right across the street, and you need these soccer fields. I mean, you need this space. Would you guys be interested in being the first ever Board of Education to take on a Brownfield project and get a cleanup grant?
In the country.
Right, in the country. Nobody had done it because nobody had thought to ask, I guess, the Board of Education to do it. And they said yes, because they really needed it. It's actually part of the need, and the reason it's the Alex Rickley Memorial Soccer Complex is they had students that would traverse Route 522, which you guys may not know, but it's not like 295 out here, but it's still pretty fast. I mean, it's a 2-lane road that runs like 295 out here. And unfortunately, we lost a great soul who was on her way to a practice alongside of the road. So after that accident, it suddenly sort of jumps up to everybody's mind that we have to do something. And they had already named it the Memorial Soccer Field. So could you imagine? So the commission takes it. They call it the Memorial Soccer Complex because she had passed away, and now they can't play soccer on it. We used assessment dollars, used ground penetrating radar. They identified what could have been a tank or something else underground, and we worked with the Board of Ed to take ownership from the county. And what we had to do was assure, the county had taken it on, and they thought it was a good idea to take it on and didn't think they needed due diligence. So it was a lot of education. It wasn't just like they were like, we should give it up. And then you have the Board of Education that said, well, if there's such a problem here, what do we do? But there was also other needs related to stormwater management in the area that was impacting their fields on the other side. And there was nobody actively on the DEP side. Again, and even in Maryland, on the Brownfield side, I know you can do enforcement, but that's not the purpose. You're calling in your environmental agency to help on the redevelopment side of things. And so everybody knew what our goal was from the beginning. And the Board of Ed took it on, came up with the cost share through a number of different ways that there's a lot of ways to do the cost share. So if you're looking at a cleanup grant and you're worried about the cost share.
Apply now, because you don't need cost share.
You don't need cost share right now, but if you ever do, there are definitely ways to work with the agency to come up with that cost share. And so then, once we got the school board on board, we had those same agreements in place. We had the cleanup started, and probably the biggest hindrance we ran into was we did run it through the voluntary program, but the assessment was so thorough, I'll say, was so thorough that at the end of the day, I was approached by the consultant and said, well, you don't actually need to clean the site up. Like, we can risk it all away. And I said, well, we just spent the last 2.5 years explaining to the community why this isn't a good site for a soccer complex right now until we clean it up. So we really need to do something physical here. And when you're working with an EPA cleanup grant, you're allowed to use some of that cleanup funding to actually remediate the site. And if the remediation of the site is bringing in cover, it doesn't always have to be asphalt. It could be dirt. It could be sod. We did not get the field turfed. There was some discussion about that, and I hadn't made any promises regardless of what some of the people told me. But bringing in grassy, I mean, just getting the field finished and marked, that was all part of the cleanup grant. We didn't, while they received other funding, like the playground there was from Kaboom, which is a playground grant. If you guys are looking for playground money, they were able to access that. They've been able to highlight this site over the last few years since they got it launched. But the school board still owns it. They never gave it back to the county. The county didn't even want it anymore because all the county wanted was a place for the kids to play. But again, we also, both the assistance center and the community, when you're working with all your stakeholders, laid out the vision for what it was going to become and was able to use the overlay of the fields to help determine what the cleanup was going to be. So, so the school board was fun, and I'm still friends with most of them. Oh, yeah. Any questions about, is anybody here from the school board? So no librarians, no school boards. You guys got to get creative. School boards?
Yeah, I talked to her before.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing is with old schools and school boards, you get into the situation where you may want to transfer property that you own so you could deal with the asbestos or other things on your old dilapidated schools that can be considered brownfields, especially when you have a good reuse. So you're probably, if you're on the school board, we're probably a responsible party for the school itself, so you may need to find another partner, maybe an EDA, to transfer those sites to. And then, so this is a site that was actually, if you guys remember World War II, I think everybody's kind of a thing right now. Like they used this in Morgantown, West Virginia to, as part of the industrial complex. Don't have to, they made things, they did things, it was called Morgantown Ordnance Works, and those stacks are still standing, but they had come in and years later, so it ran and shut down in, I believe, 1960, and then it sat there for years and years and years. So somebody came in to try to scrap it out and demo it, but you see this spot right here? So this, on the end of here, there was the person who was scrapping it and doing the demolition, this catwalk got cut out from underneath them, and unfortunately they passed away. And then that site sat for another 25 years because no one was going to mess with that, because all of the soil that's around here was contaminated with the asbestos that fell from all the pipes and metal and things that they were ripping off of when they were doing that in the late 90s, I believe, if I have my dates right. So the whole industrial park was purchased by another redevelopment group. They start redeveloping it, but then you have this huge eyesore next to the river, next to the rail, an active rail line that could be used. And so they needed to find a partner. And in West Virginia, we have a land bank, a land reuse corporation, the West Virginia Land Stewardship Corporation. And they worked out a deal with that property owner, because this was what I was talking about. It's 2 acres. It was going to take at least $500,000 to clean up. At the end of the day, I think the total was probably $900,000. It had 3,200 tons of asbestos contaminated soil that needed to be disposed of at the closest landfill, which was an hour and a half away. And that's a lot of trucks if you can only do 20 tons in a truck, or 18 if DOT's here. But you had that. You had to get the rest of the site down. You had actually an issue with, there were lots of issues. It's an old industrial facility that you're trying to clean up. And so the Land Stewardship Corporation was set up in the state, and there are similar entities in other states, I believe in Maryland as well, right, the land bank folks? Yeah, I mean, the issue is, this was actually part of a Superfund site, so how does it get to be a brownfield? I mean, that's the other transactional piece. You can do that. It's about timing, it's about how long ago it was, it's about the level of site, it's about letters, it's about liability comfort, but that was one of the things that we were able to do on the site, and it received a cleanup grant through the nonprofit, and then when the nonprofit was done, they were transferring it back to another private LLC that was building another facility here in the industrial park for use. And they had that lined up ahead of time. And how nice is that in terms of having a reuse lined up versus them just spending all this money to clean the site up and not having anything at the end. But
And the developer had a financial stake, right?
what we got from the private owner was we got a financial stake related to the purchase price back on the property that served as the match for the grant, as well as they ended up going in and participating in the revolving loan fund program. Does anybody, the Brownfield revolving loan fund program, is that, you guys have one? That allowed for additional money to come in because it was greater than the grant in terms of the cost. But the difference there is that you then have a partner that's a match that's also helping push, to be quite honest. I mean, because they have their own timeline. So then they also knew the industry and they could make decisions on what they wanted. They could be on site and say, hey, we're the end user, so we know what the spec says, but we need to tweak the spec and we'll cover this or we won't cover that. The hardest questions we got for that was, well, how is this okay? Because this private developer is going to benefit from public dollars. But in that case, this property was contaminated both either by DuPont Corporation years and years ago, maybe the federal government themselves in terms of the funding and the overall war effort, or some in-between entities. But the development group that owned the overall industrial park only wasn't eligible because they were a private entity. They weren't the potentially responsible party. So you have sort of the good guy developer scenario playing out. There are good guy developers. I mean, just to make everybody, it happens. And so they came to the table to handle that. But they also were helpful on the language because this took 3.5 years by the end of the day, by applying for the grant, getting everything out, cleaning it up, and then getting the sign-off. And most developers don't want to wait that long. And so you have to make sure that all the agreements are in place. So when it went over, the price went over, they knew exactly how much to deduct. Like they knew how much the developer was in for and what they couldn't ask for more. And so then the nonprofit knew, the Land Stewardship Corporation knew what they were in for on the project itself. So those are three things that we specifically done. EPA knew we did all of them. So it's not like we were hiding anything, but they specifically were grants received that none of these projects would have happened without EPA cleanup grants. I have no doubt in my mind. There was no way the town of Shepherdstown was going to pay to clean up a landfill that they had for 50 plus years. I don't know where the county would have come up with money. They just would have possibly done what a lot of other counties want to do, is just bury it over. I mean, they may have come in and brought their own dirt, but that's not the way we want to deal with things. And this site had no reason, we had no reason to believe it would be anything but this.
And no cleanup grant possible about the transfer.
And the cleanup grants that I just said were so essential would not have been possible without those land transfers. So, and they're all success stories. I mean, at the end of the day, and I think you guys are looking for success stories.
Did you take away?
Any questions about that one before we get him off the hook? All right. So the key takeaways from these stories and from what we've talked about so far is not to despair. Partnership can open up a lot of options. It can open up a lot of funding potentially to get your site remediated and redeveloped. So if you feel stuck because you've got this property that you're ready to apply for a cleanup grant and you just found out you don't meet those threshold criteria, there are options. Be diligent in looking for somebody and making the right choice in that relationship that makes sense for you, that makes sense for all of the parties involved, and make sure to be open in your communication about roles and expectations, not only within the transfer relationship, but also, I think, to the point about the environmental agencies, bringing them in early, making sure they're aware of what's happening, that they can give you real information about what's possible, what does a voluntary cleanup program look like, what does it look like for your site in particular, what does the EPA program look like from the beginning. And that's our show. Questions?
And everybody feel free to ask questions. I got one quick question. Going back kind of a little bit to what I said before. I'm trying to think of like a worst case scenario, trying to get into the head of someone that you're trying to transfer a property to. What is the worst case scenario that entity would be worried about?
So just to say, like, worst case scenarios happen. On this industrial park job, we're in the middle of it, and we ran into an issue where there was an easy demo. I happen to be involved on the demolition side of this, independent of anything else, just the way world works. And we demoed the top of the property, and it turned out they had sediment in these tanks, and the sediment was considered industrial process waste that needed to be disposed of. That was going to be a lot more expensive, that nobody had considered. The consultant had missed it, the owner had missed it. We didn't think about it because literally it was river water that had been pumped up 50 years ago sitting in these tanks. That's all it was. But rules had changed and everything else, so we had to navigate through that, and that's where we found additional funding, delayed the project a little bit, and we came up with revolving loan fund money. So I'm not saying there aren't any worst case scenarios, but I will say with all the projects we've done, with all the partners at the table, the worst case scenarios end up just stopping the project, not finding some plume because that's going to generate a Superfund response. You've done all that upfront paperwork. Even the stuff that we found was an issue of cost for disposal, not an issue of community contamination or further liability for the current property owner. It was just more, the asbestos soil was weighed more than they anticipated, and we found some other things. But that's why those phase 2 assessments and really making sure that we're not going to run into barrels of methyl ethyl death buried somewhere. That's why we have the next year to go through and do that. So, and I say that not to be nonchalant or to say, hey, just trust me, I've done this, because that doesn't work. Except for when I went into any of the communities I did, the only street cred we had, like when we started with the assistance centers, I didn't have any. So I started with bringing in money from the assistance centers just to be useful and say, so here's a $5,000 check, which you can actually generate from really anyone, your community foundation, and say, let's just take a look at it. Let's do first in money and say we're interested in this project. But at the end of the day, a third of brownfields that are assessed through the EPA program nationally, and this still should be true, I think, unless the percentages change, come up clean after a phase 1, or at least not necessarily recommended for a phase 2. So do you hear what I'm saying? So if they were perceived, there are lots of sites that we think are dirty that aren't as dirty as we think. That doesn't mean they don't need any cleanup whatsoever, but we've done all these projects, and they weren't as bad. Most of them, like the soccer field, that thing they found with the ground penetrating radar was just a big piece of metal that was buried. It wasn't a tank, it wasn't anything.
And I think,
Just remember, he's the one that's going to buy my property, and I have more questions. I think the worst case scenario, I think all of the theme of that is the surprise, right? What you don't know when you go in, and that's why we talked about finding out as much as you know, much as you can possibly know before. EPA grants are incredibly competitive, and there's no guarantee at the end of the day that the new owner is going to get one of those EPA grants. And so you may have to try again. We have an example of a city that took ownership of a property and had to try 3 times before they got an EPA grant. There's another example, though, where we did all of this research for the Land Stewardship Corporation. They did a phase 1, they did a phase 2, and the cleanup came back incredibly expensive, and the zoning was wrong. And so the city was not willing to rezone it for what the desired in-use was. So there was that one's stuck right now because we can't, it's owned by Habitat for Humanity. They obviously have a specific mission to do a specific thing on that property, but it's not zoned for that. Why they ever bought it in the first place, I don't know, I wasn't there. But that's a problem that we haven't been able to get over that hump, but we knew all of that before we got into it so that we didn't clean it up, get ready to build some houses, and then get stuck there, right? So it's as much as you can make the unknown known early is the only way to mitigate for that, I think. Hi.
Interesting information. So I'm one of those people who didn't raise my hand. We didn't apply, but, would love to be in a position to apply next time, right? So that pre-checklist, what's that really looking like? I hear about the phase one and, try to gather as much information you can, but really right before that application and you're ready to try to apply and you think you have all the information, what does that look like?
Call Tab, that's me, and we'll help you. So that's the other thing is having good partners that can help you sort of navigate the process. But it depends on your property and depends on your organization and where you are and what the reuse is. But there are these great services from EPA, technical assistance through us. There's other technical assistance if you don't have all the answers yet, if you don't have a reuse plan, you don't have a phase one, they have other resources to pay for those things, to send a contractor to help do that, and we can help navigate. And we have, I say it in front of the other regions, we have the best EPA regional staff in the nation. They're amazing, and I love them, and they're back there. But they're wonderful, and they want to work with you, and they're here to work with you, and we can help be that facilitator.
And tangibly, I think that is all very tangible because that's how we've started on a lot of projects, but this year's application, just go print it off.
Yes.
And just go through section by section. But start with the threshold criteria, which is always, and you may not know all the answers, but as you work through them, that becomes your checklist for the threshold criteria and learning. And then if you called your folks here in Maryland or EPA Region 3 and said, I pulled out the threshold criteria from this year, we're working through it, and these are the questions I'd have, I'm 100% confident they would say, that is fantastic, we would love to work with you, because that's showing capacity and interest from the get-go.
You're nodding like crazy.
The other fear that you probably have is cost. Like, how much is it going to cost altogether? And so I always would say that I can't raise a question mark. Like, I can raise a lot of money for projects, but if I don't know how much it's going to be, then I can't ever win that. I can't reach that goal. So I am now with a remediation firm, and you could call, it doesn't have to be us. Any of these contractors, and don't be afraid to just call and say, hey, we have a project. We don't know when we're going to do it. You don't have to burn favors or whatever and say, come out here tomorrow and look at it. But you could send them, if you had a phase one or phase two, you can have them look at that. Or you could just say, here's this building. This is what we think. This is what we think. This asbestos is in here. What's it going to take?
That doesn't seem like that fits procurement rules and regulations.
Well, you could
start talking to folks before.
Well, you could do it as formally as possible. You could go. So think about an RFP you release, right? Everybody gets mad if you turn out that you don't have the money to do it. But I read RFPs. I'm not reading them today, but every other day, I typically am getting bids in or bid requests in. But it always has the ability in there to pull it or not issue it at all. So you don't have to put in, they'll call and ask you when the timeline's going to be, and you could be honest. You could say October 1st of 2025 is the earliest we're going to start this. Maybe October 24, or no. Okay, October 2025, right? Okay, then it's my choice to show up when you do a pre-bid walkthrough and have as many people as you want. And then you can always redo it, but getting the cost up front, or at least asking them for unit cost and say, what's the going rate for abatement or soil remediation right now per, whatever.
So the folks who just turned in the application, kudos to you all. When do they get notified? How soon will they know?
The timeline is that grants are usually due in the fall, usually as close to Thanksgiving as can be annoying. And then their announcements are made in late May, early June, and all the grants start on the following fiscal year. So they'll all start October 1. So they'll find out. But that's a great point about going ahead and looking. The grant guidelines don't change very much year to year. Every now and then there'll be like a big change, right, where something happens and they change it all over. And usually we start to hear rumblings about that pretty early, several months in advance, but they're always looking for the same kind of information. And I sort of shouted to the side, it's a good time to be applying for EPA grants right now because they have a ton more money than they've ever had before. The grant caps are higher, so it used to be a $500,000 limit. Now this year it was up to a $5 million, right? Was it $5 million this year, EPA? Yeah. 500 and then 2 million and then 5 million, right? Okay, thank you. I didn't read any 5 millions as a reviewer, so I wasn't sure. And then there's no cost share. As long as they're spending that infrastructure money, there's no cost share. Their legislation has a 20% cost share in a typical year. So now's the time. And they love a cleanup. They really like to give cleanup grants.
Last question. So I heard you talk about remediation, but then it sounded like it was development as well on it. Like it wasn't just remediation. You were also doing development on it. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
So it's language. I mean, it's what's allowable in any grant. So so you have a project that you're doing remediation on. I mean, let me be clear. I'm a demolition company mainly. You can't do demolition with EPA Brownfield money. You're not supposed. No demolition. It's not allowed. It's specifically not allowed. So we just got done. We tore down the rest of that thing. Just in the project that we have to throw ourselves on the industrial park. Well, how did we tear that down? Well, the stuff inside was covered with asbestos, and it was a danger, and it was a hazard. And so it comes to the language of what you're explaining to EPA so that they can justify it internally, plus to their funders in Congress to say, how does this meet the requirements? Well, if the building is completely structurally unsound, which many brownfields are, and you're about to take off all the asbestos off the roof, off the siding, everything else, what's going to remain? So you end up getting the whole building gone. Well, in some cases, you may be taking down a building that's connected to another building, and the other building is fine. You want to save that. I like historic preservation too, even though we do demo. And how do you secure that building? And so you would explain to EPA that you need to secure that other building as part of the reuse of that structure. They could say, no. I'm not saying to just make stuff up. They want the end use as much as you do. And the other thing is you may get other money that's not EPA. What I would encourage all of you to do is, even if you're thinking about a grant for next year and you're talking to funders now, make a list of all the places you're going to apply for. You obviously can't apply for it yet because it's just closed. But then other funders will get excited about the fact that you have funding sources identified, even if you don't have that money in hand. And if you're in Maryland and you're going to apply for a brownfield grant next year, historically, Maryland has not applied for a lot of brownfield grants as a state. And so occasionally the region gets really excited when a state like that, this happened in Virginia. It's not that they're going to favor you, but they'd be thrilled. Like they got some cleanup grants to go in, then the Region 3 staff would fight like heck to make sure that they're really great applications and they get scored appropriately. I think you would, compared to the great state of Pennsylvania, Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, they get a lot of brownfield funding. I'm not saying they don't deserve it, but if they're going to apply for 20 grants and Maryland applies for 5, I think Maryland might have a shot to get one before a community in Pennsylvania that's gotten one every other year for years. So remember that. People are looking and encouraging you to apply for that money.
It is EPA's priority to get to places that they haven't been right now. So they are looking for new opportunities. Hi.
Hello. That example you briefly touched on earlier where when the assessment came back and the cost of remediation was extremely high and the city or jurisdiction was not willing to change the zoning, so it's stalling. Do you have any examples of MOUs for these land transfers in which that nonprofit or jurisdiction that's taking it on has some security that if something like that comes up, that transfer goes back to the original property owner, so that because that might make them more willing to take on that risk because they wouldn't then be saddled with that property?
I don't have that, but
it's
like one of the only towns in West Virginia that actually has zoning. so I don't have
It's like a kill switch for the deal, basically.
Yeah.
So it's not easy. I mean, when EPA, it used to be you could have an option on the property, and EPA doesn't allow for that. The key is not the fact that the entity that took it could give it back, because that's kind of easy. It's how did they make sure they're not in the line of liability later on, because if they're going to transfer it back, and also making sure that the entity they got it from will accept it back.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to think of when we had to. We've been really good at catching like just things that I got excited about that Carrie said don't be excited about, that we did more work on. That
I have a
didn't-
question.
Yeah, the questions have come up that we've had to give back, but I mean, no, I mean, to be honest, the best deal in that case, like, because you're trying to assure the person is, if that site doesn't get cleaned up now by this current energy and effort, like, because you've now activated everybody, and they're like, we want this project to be done. If it doesn't get cleaned up now, when is it going to get cleaned up? And it's in the best interest of the entity that's receiving it to go through the voluntary program to receive those liability protections, and then maybe transfer it back at that point.
Or be able to market it.
Right. Yeah, I'm trying to.
Well, I guess that gets back to like the whole worst case scenario discussion. Like that is a worst case scenario. That you have to stop it and stall it. But I mean, I think it's a good point that you put all this energy into it so far. You know, they'd come back to you all and like, how can we make this work?
But by their nature, brownfields are not. We were joking about. So, I mean, they're not sexy sites. I mean, I like them and I see them when I'm driving around. But I use brownfields as a way to push redevelopment, not as just a finite definition of that project. And so, the way that I look at it is, there is a concern that then it gets held forever and you have these holding costs. But I would be challenged, although I'm sure some of the consultants in the room may have like really worst case scenarios. But really, the best answer is to push through whatever it is. I mean, I don't know of a town that was bankrupt by one of these projects. I don't know a private developer that was bankrupt, or a development authority that was bankrupt. I really don't think so. I mean, I'd love EPA to come up with more data like that, but I'm not saying we don't have any failures.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is, by nature, these are long-term projects to begin with, and so that's why you have to find long-term partners. But we just haven't had them. I mean, if they've got plumes and they already have a concern, then the environmental agencies are picking up on that ahead of time. I mean, you're noticing the monitoring wells when you're walking around, and you're like, oh, this could be bad. We've run into PCBs on sites that weren't there. I mean, they were there, but maybe not as identified as they should be, but work through that. Because once you have everybody in, it's not just the developer, it's not just the grantee and the community. The state agencies are typically engaged already, and EPA is engaged. So you have all these people that are vested in the success, and that's different than in most real estate deals where you're just like, nobody came to we did it and we built it and nobody came. I guess you have to pay the bill. It's not like that.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I would just add the other thing I just kind of said quietly to him was that if you did go forward and redevelop and remediate it, at least, it's at least somewhat more marketable. So maybe it might not go back to the previous owner, but if it's cleaner, it may be easier to find somebody else to take it now that you've dealt with the environmental, right? It may make the math work for another owner. The one I talked about is some other, anyway, if anybody can help me figure out how to do that, it'd be great. There's a bunch of federal money tied up in it. Other questions? Thanks so much.
So the other thing, sorry, I'm just getting really excited about this, is that, so EPA is super smart, and their officers know their programs, but I would get asked all the time, we had a great project that turned an old glass factory into what is now a kayak launch and a public recreation spot. But that end user kept calling DEP after they were done with the cleanup grant, done with the voluntary program, and every time they wanted to do something, they would say, are we allowed to do it? And the agency finally called them back and said, you have to read your land use covenant, you have to read the paperwork that you were required to do. But stop, we're not giving you permission. This is set up to say what you are allowed to do and not allowed to do, and if we don't say in this language, in this, the land use covenant, in the voluntary remediation agreement, that you're not allowed to do it, then you could do it. I mean, we're not going to give you permission because they don't want to be liable for it either. So same with EPA. When you have a grant or you're working on a project, the officers would, my experience has been, tell them what you're going to do, not what you want them to get permission to do, because if you're not supposed to do it, they'll tell you that too. Like they'll say, you can't do that. But if you ask them all the time, I mean, I don't know if there are any attorneys in the room, but like if you call an attorney and ask if it's okay to do something, like if they're good, they probably tell you no, because there's probably some reason you shouldn't. But if you tell them what you're going to do and then ask them to set it up so to make sure you're okay while you do it, but you're not giving them that choice, then they'll find a way for you to do it. So it's just an approach for you guys to take and use all your resources. But thanks for all your time this afternoon. I appreciate it.
All right, I wanted to thank Carrie and Patrick, especially since they came out of state, to be here today. I want to thank everybody who attended today and also folks who came out of state or far away to make it here to the conference today. And we want to thank Maryland Department of Environment as well for everything they've done to make this event happen today. We have closing remarks. I also want to mention there are still some leftover lunches and waters, so you're more than welcome to take some home as you like. So please do so. And we're very grateful to have Tyler Abbott here today for closing remarks. He is the Director of the Land and Materials Administration here at MDE. All right, go ahead. Thank you.
All righty. Wow, what a great event today. You know, we're so fortunate to have a packed agenda from land banks and leveraging to partnerships and program updates from our team. For those who don't know me, I just heard my name, but I'm Tyler Abbott. I'm director here of the Land and Materials Administration. So I get to oversee the land restoration program as part of my portfolio, as well as a bunch of other things that kind of fit together. One of the best parts of my job is getting to see all of the progress that's being made around the state, specifically on brownfield sites. I truly appreciate the work of every one of you. Every property that we're able to remediate, means one less property that we have to worry about. One less opportunity for someone to come in contact with historical pollution, one less chance for ground or surface water to be affected. Here in Baltimore, we have such a rich history of industry, which, took its toll on the area. But when you look out at the skyline, you see all the progress that's been made. For most of us here, we also think about the progress that we don't see. The seeps that have been stopped and the chemicals that have been capped. The progress doesn't stop in Baltimore, though. From Salisbury to Hagerstown and everywhere in between, we are seeing great projects that are rebuilding communities, driving business, and providing much-needed jobs within these areas. All right, I know I'm the last thing keeping you guys from walking out of here, and so I'm going to make it quick. I'm going to end the rambling on progress because we've heard that all day. But I do want to just take a second to acknowledge all of the staff from Department of Planning, from Montgomery Park, from MDE, who were able to assist in putting this together today. So if I can have a quick round of applause, thank you, everybody. All right. And then selfishly, I also want to take a minute to just thank my staff from the Land Restoration Program for the dedication to their work and for continuing to provide excellent customer service that directly leads to strong economic development within the state. And we just hear it one more time. I appreciate it. All right. All right. So with that, I said it was going to be quick. So just thank you so much for being with us today, and I really look forward to seeing everybody here next year. All right.